Speaking of quarterbacks, I think this one is interesting to me because the combine is coming up next week. You and C-Rob will be there, so we'll have plenty of reporting from it on next week's episode. I do think it's interesting because Athletes First, which represents CJ Stroud, has advised all clients to skip the combine's cognitive testing. I want to remind people that last year going into the draft, there was a lot of conversation about the fact that CJ Stroud scored poorly on the test and then came in and absolutely whooped at the NFL level. It was an interesting conversation because last year, everybody was trying to figure out. I think we forget, that people tried to have their questions about CJ Stroud. For whatever he did at the college level, there were people that weren't 100% sure. And this cognitive test became part of this negative conversation about CJ, whether it was the way he processes information, all these stupid things that turned out to not have anything to do with it. So I don't really blame Athletes First for saying, hey, number one, we've proven that this test is useless to actual success on the field. Number two, I'm not going to put any of my guys through it.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that I believe Athletes First has enough power to take down this test if they want to. They'll have to decide if they want to take the test down. And I mean, topple it, fight it versus not actually just remove it. Or if they want to say, we're not doing it, you guys do what you want. But that matters. They have a lot of top clients. They have a lot of quarterbacks in particular. And you could say that the way that the quarterback reads the field is most important of every position. I think that's probably accurate. What I think is interesting is that Daniel Jeremiah from NFL Network did a call today, and there are a lot of interesting takeaways. But one of them that stood out is when he was talking about CJ Stroud, he said he had not seen anybody process the field as clearly and as confidently as CJ Stroud did in their first year in the league, ever. And again, I know a bunch of us know that, but to me, when I hear someone like Jeremiah say it, who I just really trust the way he evaluates, I think that's fascinating. And I think it's not just that this test was a little bit off or that it was unhelpful or that it was neutral. It was misdirection if you were to follow it, assuming that the report was accurate about CJ Stroud's score. And so I think we struggle with this idea. I was asking Jeremiah today, how have you seen quarterback evaluation evolve over the last 10 years? What's different now versus then? And he was saying, well, because you look at the Super Bowl and you have Brock Purdy on one side and Patrick Mahomes on the other. And they came from the first round, a premier first round pick. And then you have the obvious last pick of the draft, Mr. Irrelevant. And both of them end up in the Super Bowl. I'm not saying they're the same level of quarterback, but they did both take their teams to the Super Bowl. And so I think then you start to ask yourself, what are we valuing? Where are the common threads generally? And DJ said he's just hearing a lot of teams who say experience in college and readiness and being the more that is thrown at them, the better. That is increasingly becoming a premium in the evaluation process. It's not just about the upside, how tantalizing it is, the traits. Yeah, for sure that matters, but that's always mattered. And I think the experience is starting to catch up to it. And so I think that what we struggle with a test like this is that a test like this is such a specific piece of information. And it's also no guarantee. It's not, here's what they played. At some point, just look at the film. But we have this process where we have analytics now. We have digital media. There's more accessibility to film than ever before, different ways to watch film. And so teams are constantly trying to keep up. But sometimes more information is not better information. And they need to still use all of this as ancillary supporting evidence rather than the main thing. And the last thing I'll say about this is I think that what will be interesting is if Athletes First makes this decision, one, do other big agencies like a Clutch or like a Clutch or a CAA, are they going to advise their clients similarly? And how much of a role does an NFL team have in it? Because you might not have your guy just take it preemptively, but what if an NFL team says hey, I want you to take it? Are you really going to tell your client, do not take this when a team tells you to take it? Because what if that team has two guys and one of them's willing to take it and they view that? I mean, again, do I think that's going to really make or break a draft position? No. But do I think that you're risking something when there's already such a competitive field? I do think it's a risk.
I love your very middle statement there that I think is an important one of watch the film. And, one thing that always stood out to me when I first started covering the draft was if you go in and you just talk to guys that don't cover the NFL, they cover college football, and you go in and you ask questions of the guys that cover college football, you get a real sense of who these players are up and down. And then you can apply that from the film that they've watched to whether or not you think it works in the NFL. I think one of the I don't want to say problems, but one of the things that makes draft evaluation tougher and tougher is you have a million people out there that are cramming so much film in so little time and then putting out snap judgments, as opposed to somebody that's been covering college football for 15 years and has seen every snap of this guy's career. I just think it hits different. And it's one of the reasons why I always consider myself sort of an aggregator of information. When you talk about guys, instead of sitting here, when Will Levis last year was being rumored to climb all the way up to the first overall pick by some people, all you had to do was talk to the 10 or 15 people that was around constantly Will Levis, and you got a real sense of, okay, he's probably an early second round pick, and these are the things he's good at. These are the things he's not good at. Like the college guys have a better sense of all of that. I think what's interesting is that we get into over-analysis in so much of what we're seeing. And this cognitive test is a perfect example of it. Watch the film on CJ Stroud. Go back. Like, I was there for the Ohio State-Georgia game where he just absolutely crushed him. And I think it was the 6th game I'd been at of his that year. And you start to look at these things in person and you say, my God, like, there are no questions. I was standing on the sideline when Joe Burrow won a national championship. And I looked at one of my buddies. We'd seen several games that year. And I kept saying, this guy, why are we not talking about him the way we talk about Andrew Luck? Like, I think sometimes what happens in the draft process and at the combine is we fall in love with attributes more than just what a player has actually done. And that's the hardest thing to avoid in Indy. And it's going to be interesting because the other thing that I think is really important and different right now to what you said earlier, these guys are older and they've played more football than most classes because of COVID. That gives you more tape on anybody. Like, you go on one date with somebody, you might fall 4 dates with somebody, you think it's great. By the time you get to 20th date, maybe it's not as good. I think film sometimes is the same way. Like, when you have more and more and more, you really get to see who Bo Nix is as a quarterback, right? Like, teams are going to get over obsessed with the interview. But I would just challenge that there's more film than ever on these guys. Just go watch the film and figure out, like, does this guy fit in my system?
Right. And I think it's hard because Daniel Jeremiah was actually talking today about how the hardest thing to evaluate is how the guy is seeing the field. And so then you're saying, like, how is he being coached to see it? What is his read? Like, what's the system telling him? It's not just about how he's thinking. It's about how he's thinking within the confines of the system. Does he have his protection? Does he have the right pass catchers? Does he have a play caller who's calling the plays in a right order in the best way? I mean, is his play caller setting him up for success? And so I actually think a bigger obstacle to the draft, I don't know about a bigger obstacle, but I would say one of the things that I think is actually interrupting the draft process is that guys are getting set up with agencies who are so massively overcoaching them. And maybe you say, well, hey, if you're going to have to study for a test in the real league and you're going to have to, like, get the playbook, then you're studying for the test for the combine and it works, like, great. Like, Fitz, we already talked about what it means to cram. But to me, and I talked about this at the Senior Bowl when I interviewed Michael Penix Jr., and he actually answered my question when I asked him, like, what was he breaking down for a team on film and what kind of questions were they asking him in their Senior Bowl interviews. And he's like, well, is it 6? I think it was like a drop 6, whatever. He got into the entire coverage, what his route was on one side for the receiver, what it was on the other, how it changed based on his protections, how it changed based on what the defender did. Here's what he had to read from the linebacker. I mean, he had this whole level of detail, and the clip kind of went viral. I didn't realize at the time that apparently he doesn't usually give detailed answers because, like, I don't watch college football. So I just think it was interesting because it kind of reminded me of, like, we've gotten into this, like, super sanitized, super staged, super scripted cycle of the draft evaluation process. And if I were teams, I would want to know, is there any way to make this more authentic? Like, stop expecting guys to have the perfect answers to the test, and more try and get them to, like, get in the moment. And I know in some of these interviews, they are having conversations where it's like, hey, you don't know what's going to be asked, and so you can't be prepped for it. But I feel like there are probably ways in which the combine prep not only does a disservice to the team's ability to evaluate, but also a disservice to the players. I'm probably going to have agents who are not so happy about this, but I think it's true.
No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And the process is in some ways broken because one thing that is just undeniable is that the draft is a crapshoot, right? And I would like to believe that There are 32 head coaches. I'd like to believe that most of them are incredibly qualified and know more football than most of us will ever know in our lives. I would like to believe that 32 GMs are the same way. The people that have come up through the scouting world, they know more than Twitter X is ever going to know about these things. They live it, they eat it, they breathe it, they feed their families doing it. How do they get it wrong so often? And anytime your accuracy rate is that low when it comes to something like, look, I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on a lot of things, but I'll go back to music. Like if you had me stand on the side of a stage and watch a festival all day and ask me at the end of the day to figure out if guitar players were good or bad, doesn't matter the kind of music they're playing. I've been doing that my whole life. I can look around and say, yeah, he's pretty good. He stinks. He's being covered up by tracks. He knows what he's doing. Like you should be able to do that. And if you put 20 of us on the side of the stage, we'd all be able to do that. I cannot for the life of me figure out how so many GMs, coaches, and scouts get it so wrong when it comes across the board with first rounders, second rounders, third round, like all across the draft. It's so impossible for teams to get it right. It alarms me that they've never sat back and said, how do we make this process cleaner so that more teams can be more successful in the draft?